faith is something that we can't see, we can't feel or touch with our senses. When you think about faith, it's something maybe you would like to imagine or put in the imagination, which could be someday, which could happen someday, which might happen someday to myself. Or maybe there would be a faith in an object, such as I have faith, for instance, I'm sitting on this chair right now, and you can see the chair. I have faith that this chair is holding me up and I'm not going to fall down, that it supports me. We place faith in objects or in things every day. So the area of, and excuse me, and I'm going to be looking up with my hands, looking up a little bit. It's not light from God, it's actually the light of my screen. And I'm also going to be referring to a book here, if you can see that, application of biblical application. The faith I think that's important to look at is, of course, there's many different types of faith, would be faith towards something which is going to happen, and it has a reference towards someone, and particular faith in a force, a stimulus, a thing that we haven't seen. Could we call it God? Could we call it something to happen in the future? Saying that when do we have ineffective faith? When is the faith actually working against us rather than for us? And there's some instances here that we can learn from Genesis 16:3, and where Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abraham as a wife. And we realize that she sped things up. She decided to take things into her hand. So she gave Abraham, she gave Abraham, her servant, and said, come on, you can, come into this servant girl of mine, and that way we'll have a child. And so that way she actually rushed into things, and we see that later on it actually becomes a disaster if you read in Genesis 16:3. We look at what happened there, and here I'm just reading, Sarah took matters into her own hands by giving Hagar to Abraham. Like Abraham, she had trouble believing God's promise that was apparently directed specifically towards Abraham and Sarah. And so we can see that that would be an ineffective faith example. The other example here is found in Matthew 3:8. Here it says, prove by the way you live that you have really turned from your sins and turned to God. He was writing here, John compared people who claim they believe in God but don't live for him to unproductive trees, and which are cut down. Just as fruit trees is expected to bear fruit, God's people should produce a crop of good deeds. God has no use for people who call themselves Christians but do not do anything good about it. And maybe some of you are thinking or saying to yourself, yeah, I can understand that. I say that myself, that I have faith, but yet I can't stop cursing, or I can't stop smoking, or I can't stop a certain addiction. But I have faith in God. I go to church. I read my Bible, whatever. In some ways, that faith that you are talking about it's really not authentic faith in God to perform something, because usually that kind of faith is marked by a changed life. So one of the ways we see that if a person's changed is you look into your fruit, you look into how your life is different compared to before. And sometimes you may not be able to tell what it is or how it is, but other people will be able to. So you can always ask other people, say, well, have I changed? Have I become any different? Have I become in a certain area of my obedience toward God, or in a personal area of personal sin or some kind of addiction, so something that you'd be struggling with. So just to wrap things up here, some faith quotes. And faith begins where the hopes and possibilities of man end. I don't know who that author was who said that quote. And we are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know, which is said by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his letter to Eberhard Bethge, 29th of May, 1944. It brings me to another thought that you will be accountable for what you do know, not for what you don't know. I'm accountable for what I know, and even apply what I don't or what I do know, not what all of a sudden I didn't know. And that's where faith comes in. Faith is not something that's just far out there. It actually becomes very, very practical. Again, where we begin applying what we do know rather than what we don't know with what we have. So there's only certain materials that you can be responsible for living in our life, and that faith is something that is actually very real and tangible when you realize, hey, I can make that next step towards getting out of bondage, or I can make the next step towards seeking help for this area or this problem, or I can become more productive in my business and make this next step. One more quote by Anselm of Canterbury says, "For I do not seek to understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. For I believe even this, that unless I believe, I shall not understand." So this brings to another aspect of faith, which is very interlinked with the faith I have been speaking about here the whole time, and that is that we first believe in order to understand. And it sounds like blind faith, yeah, but we do that with a date, don't we? When we invite someone out we don't know, or even a blind date, and you're kind of like seeking out that person, and after that you understand more of what that person is like after you get to know her. And that's kind of what faith is like too. We first believe that in order to understand later things which are going to be coming up that'll make a lot more sense. So faith is that same way. I believe in order to understand. I take that first step in order to draw near, to get out of bondage, or to draw near to God. And then unless you don't believe, you will not understand. So these are some of the real basic elements of faith that come into actual practice when you begin practicing and exercising your faith. So one more here. Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence, by Richard Dawkins. So forget having to evaluate evidence. You just cop out and say, I have faith. And in some ways, it's not a negative cop out, it's a real positive cop out, because what you're actually doing is you're placing your faith, working with that faith, which is like, oh, I don't want to trust. I need the evidence before I believe. I need to somehow work it out and figure it all out before I can put my trust in something greater, or in my chair, even though we put our faith in, I'm putting my faith in my chair now. Richard Dawkins is kind of saying, what a joke. Faith is a joke. Faith is a cop-out, because you don't need to think, you don't need to prove, and you don't need to evaluate and get hard evidence of something. And of course, I encourage you to find hard evidence for the things that you believe in.